Okay, so Chris and Gary, welcome. I will introduce you. So Chris Sarra is an Australian educationalist and the founder and chairman of the Stronger, Smarter Institute. Uh, Chris is of Aboriginal and Italian heritage and became the first Aboriginal principal of Cherbourg State School in southeast Queensland. And in 2016 joined the University of Canberra as a professor of education. Chris has received multiple awards for his contributions to Indigenous education, and critical realism is one of the cornerstones of his work, mainly in his book Strong and Smart, Towards a Pedagogy for Emancipation. So in recognition of his work in critical realism and Indigenous education, we are delighted to have him with us today. For a conversation on a panel we are organizing for the special issue on human nature relations. Gary MacLennan is the supervisor of an intellectual mentor of Chris, and he's working for the Stronger and Smarter Institute. His interests are interdisciplinary, and they're also grounded in Roy Bhaskar's critical realism and Indigenous education. So Chris and Gary, thank you for accepting our invitation today.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to share this platform with you. Really delighted.
Absolutely.
So just to start the conversation and maybe contextualize your work a bit, I was wondering if both of you could tell us a little bit about how you came across critical realism. And in specific, I think, Chris, you have mentioned that Roy Bhaskar visited you at some point. So I was wondering if you can share the story of that visit, like what was the context, what stood out as memorable, and how this influenced your work.
Sure, thank you. Look, as you said earlier, I was the first Aboriginal principal of Cherbourg State School. It's an all Aboriginal school and an all Aboriginal community. And at that point, that was back in 1998. At that point, there was very limited expectation and belief about the human potential of First Nations children. In fact, what we saw right across the country was that they were failing miserably. And yet somehow we just came to accept that. And so for me, because of personal experiences that we may get to later on, I had known what it was like, and I'd known the consequences of being subjected to low expectations of me as a young Aboriginal student growing up in a country that was pretty racist. In the 1970s, my hometown is Bundaberg, and that's my grandfather's country and my grandmother's country. But we grew up in an environment where we were subjected to limited expectations or stifled beliefs about who we were as black kids from East Bundaberg, the wrong suburb, apparently. And as a consequence, we could have easily been complicit with those low expectations. But thankfully for me and all of my brothers and sisters, we had a very hard-working Italian father who taught us the value of working extremely hard. And we had a very strong and very fiercely proud Aboriginal mother who made sure that, both of them in their own way were not educated in a formal sense, but they understood the power and value of education. And so they pushed us and helped us to deal with issues such as racism in such a way that ensured that we weren't the losers in that circumstance and that we could rise above that. Again, I'm happy to come back to that later on. But I went on to have a very successful career. In 1985. I went to Teachers College, and that's where I met Dr. Gary MacLennan, who was a feisty Irishman who used to swear quite a lot in lectures, that, from what I remember. But he grabbed me by the intellectual scruff of the neck and helped me to see the world differently. And Gary and I have been friends and colleagues, and he's been my intellectual mentor for all of these years since 1985. So fast forward to 1998, when I became the school's first Aboriginal principal, having been subjected to stifled beliefs about who I was as a young Aboriginal kid. I knew and recognized the toxic stench of low expectations. And it was clear that if I went to the school as the school leader with the hierarchical power that I had, if I met those children in that community with stifled beliefs and low expectations, then they would either succumb or be complicit in those low expectations. But I also knew that if I came to that relationship with high expectations and belief and a sense of hope and a determination to connect with the humanity of those children that we served and those families and those communities, then we could truly rise above what was just expected of every Aboriginal school right across the country. And at the time, I had started writing my PhD, and that's where Gary had introduced me to Roy, and I think what a special honor that was to be in the presence of Roy, such a great and wonderful man and human being who I became very good friends with along the way, and had visited him in London, and he had come to visit me while I was working at Cherbourg. And it struck me at the time that he was a philosopher who was ahead of his time, and I don't know that we'll appreciate just the richness of the intellect that he's offered the world. I think for another 30, 40, 50 years, I think he was a man before his time. And I think when I look at that, the most powerful thing that he taught me that was reflected in our conversations about this notion of the concrete universal, it gave me a way to understand myself and gave me a way to understand the work that we were doing. And it helped me to see a way through the context of being a Aboriginal principal, young Aboriginal man in essentially what is a colonized society, and in which this kind of master-slave sort of dialectic emerges, and colonizers only know how to colonize. And in that kind of a relationship, the tendency or the default, which is the only one that they know, is to cause those who are different to become same like them. So from their perspective, the only way forward is for like you to become like me. And that's such a dishonorable kind of paradigm. And from many of the deep conversations, and again, as I say, the notion of the concrete universal helped me to understand that we can be same and we can be different, and that more recently my thinking has pushed towards this notion of individual and relational sovereignty, in which I can be all of who I am. I can be Italian. I can embrace my sense of being Italian. I can embrace my sense of being Aboriginal, and I have every right to do that, knowing that they are each of those are mediations upon my core humanity. But each one of those layers or mediations on their own is not the totality of who I am. And that's what Roy's kind of intellectual concept of the concrete universal, which is quite emancipatory. And I could see that could set a lot of people free, particularly young people who thought that to reinforce their sense of being Aboriginal, they had to play up at school or disengage from school or run amok in the communities. But all the while, they didn't understand that was a contaminated perspective, and it had been contaminated by the colonizers, contaminated by white people. They were tricked into thinking that their place was on the bottom. And so when we came to Cherbourg, part of our role was to untrick them and to get them to lean into their sense of being Aboriginal and to understand what the authentic truth about being Aboriginal was. And at the same time, realizing that they didn't have to forget about being Aboriginal to become colonized or become like white people, that they could, and even if they had other ancestry as mediations upon that, then they could embrace those as well and celebrate that upon their core humanity. And I think it helped me kind of get my head around the I say complexity, but it's actually, now that I understand the intellectual concept, it's actually not a complexity. But at the time, maybe it was this complexity of being of mixed heritage, and which one do you have to be, because you can't measure it by blood, and you understand that it's reflected in behaviors. And that brings me to the kind of one of the other deeper points about Roy's work, is that those mediations resonate differently according to time and place. And so when I'm in, as I've explained in other forums, when I'm in Italy and I'm speaking with my half brother and two sisters over there, we share the same father but a different mother. And when I'm speaking Italian with them, my sense of being Italian is resonating very strongly. Does it mean that I've stopped being Aboriginal? No, it just means that my sense of being Italian is resonating stronger than my sense of being Aboriginal. So it does change. And if we understand the total kind of concrete universal concept, then we can be more comfortable about such things. So from a critical realist perspective, I think Roy helps us to go deeper and to understand the complexities and the notion of what's real for people. That it's real that my father was Italian, and that comes with ways of thinking and behaving that are particularly Italian. And it's also real that my mum is Aboriginal, and that comes with things that influence my behavior and thinking and way of connecting with other people and all of those. And I can be all of those things, and I can adapt to the context. And so this I think it invokes that kind of notions of that the ontological depth that Roy talks about, and the complexity. So people are not just one thing, we are many things in many moments, and that can be changed. So coming back to the school, I think I'd gone in writing my PhD, meeting Roy, and it was such a wonderful thing to have him come and visit and see. And he said the thing I was most proud of was when he talked about his philosophies and the deeper intellectual. He says, that's it, that's what you're doing, is the things that I'm talking about. That notion of the one special thing he said was that notion of re-enchanting the world. You're doing that by stimulating a sense of vibrancy about these children and their families' culture. Yeah, so that was pretty special. I'm happy to pause there and let Gary speak some if he likes.
Yeah, well, just listening to Chris, I'm reminded of Marx's remark that the educator must be educated. And it's the process I've learned enormous amount from Chris, contemplating and thinking about his work. And that's good. That's both very good and very necessary. But I wanted to say just a little about my own turn to critical realism. I was doing my PhD on documentary film theory, and it was based around notions of it was at the height of postmodernist skepticism, when the academy was deeply, deeply unserious. When Nietzsche, well, it was neo-Nietzschean perspectivalism, but I didn't know that at the time, ruled the roost. We didn't have the truth, we had perspectives. And a lecturer would get up and tell these young 18-year-olds, there's no such thing as the truth. And nobody had the courage to ask him, is that true? And so for me, like, the Roy's work on the alethic truth, the reason for things, a very profound notion, really helped me ground my particular work, and also grounded my opposition to what was happening around me, politically and socially. I mean, it was real, but it wasn't, in a sense, it was very untrue. And I mean, the radicalism of critical realism, and Roy, I have to say, I think that Roy really enjoyed my radicalism. He loved it, and it was a scandal to many people, but he encouraged it, uh, and he would tell stories about it. Yes, and yeah, it's a wonderful journey. But that for me was an antidote to postmodernist skepticism and an insistence that we should be serious, not boring, but serious about it, and not tricky. Like the emancipation of a people, as I said at the recent conference, is a serious business. And Chris is like one of the world's great practical jokers, I can tell you, but he's deadly serious about the emancipation of his people. And it's the only way, and that's what I've got from critical realism. And there's much, much more. Like it is wonderful, really. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you both very much. I'm really, I didn't meet Roy myself, but I'm really impressed by the stories that people share all over the world and the impact of his ideas,
Yes, yes.
not just as an individual, because now I think it's more of a collective. But so I want to ask a question now about your book and your PhD thesis. You say at some point that you're using an indigenous approach to writing a PhD or a book. And by that, at this point at least, you refer to telling the story from the inside, but without compromising academic rigor. So I think that because there are a lot of conversations around the methodological development of critical realism, I wanted to ask both of you, like, if you can say a little bit more about this approach and its methodological contribution.
Yeah, for me, obviously I wanted to write a PhD, and I wanted to write a very serious PhD that was, in a sense, untouchable, because I did know that I was writing as an Aboriginal man, and that sometimes in a when you live in a racist society or I'd finished writing the PhD. I was working at the school at the same time around 2004. Yeah, I finished writing it in 2004. And there were other debates going on in Australia where I was watching other Aboriginal academics getting picked off, and I didn't want to get picked off. I was mindful of that. So I came to the task of writing the PhD, which was later converted to the book, ensuring that it was watertight and it would withstand the that need for that justifiable need for academic rigor. And so my methodologies were sound. The intellect was very sound and was very solid, actually. And I was aware that it was possibly new to a lot of people. And added to that was the need for me to come to that task without surrendering myself. So I didn't have to, was very mindful of not being like in that moments of writing that, I didn't stop being Aboriginal. And that's been the case everywhere I've gone. And again, it's because of Roy, who's helped us to understand these things. I've never had to surrender being Aboriginal to work as a school principal. I could work in that job, if you like, and retain my sense of, as we've come to talk about it more recently, with that sense of relational sovereignty. I can bring all of who I am. I can bring all of my cultural identity to the role. And I think what we realize is once I've got the freedom to do that, whether it's to come to the role of running a school or to come to the role of Director General, running a government department, or whether it's coming to the role of writing a PhD as a serious academic, I don't need to forget or surrender my sense of being Aboriginal. And in fact, when I bring all of who I am to that task, the task is richer for it. And so, you know, I was mindful that at the time of writing my PhD and all of those things I talked about, some of it would be new to some people. So I thought it was good to be able to influence the literature in that kind of way, in a way that I believe was positive and somewhat leading the way for other Aboriginal academics. And, you know, I take very seriously the notion of that when we come to a task like that or come to a role, it's not only just about not surrendering who we are as Aboriginal people and having the confidence to bring all of who we are to that role, but it's also knowing that we are confident in our sense of identity, but also confident and competent in terms of our role, whether it's our role as a director general, as a school principal, as an academic. So all of those things become important. And again, it's worth reflecting on that in the context of the various mediations, so that if I took that to contemplate that mediation of me being a serious academic, then that came with a range of elements that had to be taken seriously. You know, like having the methodology right, having the background reading right, having the referencing right, having the intellectual argument stack up, and all of those sorts of things. That's what you have to do as an academic who wants to be taken serious. The mistake I saw some other people make, and I think that this is an ongoing conversation and argument and point of reflection, is that some people will come to that task and think that we have to lower the bar or water down expectations about who we are as an academic to be accommodated as an Aboriginal person or a First Nations person. And that's simply not true. Like, you know, and so we've got to be able to find a way to assert with confidence who we are as Indigenous writers and academics, and also assert who we are as academics or writers in our own right. I hope that makes sense.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Gary, would you like to add anything?
Yes, well, yes, of course. One of the things as an outsider, I mean, an Irishman migrating and a migrant and an outsider here in many senses. One thing, getting to know and work with Indigenous people. One of the key differences is, but their sense of what it is to be polite, their sense of what it is to show respect, their protocols, which are violated every moment by white people, and it's like your right to speak, who you are, where you come from, what is your country, who are your people. These are all very important things in the Indigenous world, and with contrast that with us, it's what you've read. what articles, what your publications. The right to speak, their version, when they being Indigenous people, seems to me as an outsider, their right to speak is linked to their concept of what it is to be a human being, what it is to be on the planet, to be in the world, and one of the big mind expanding moments is this. The fairly recent discovery, Indigenous people have been here for over 60,000 years. The mind can't contemplate that. 60,000 years of indigeneity. And to use what I understand, a Bascarian argument, their society had to be based on law and love and order, or it would not have survived the millennia. So any idea that the Aboriginal way of life was nasty, brutish, and short, it's just not possible, So, that whole anti-Indigenous thing, which the white colonists brought with us, and we should talk about, because really what we're living through is settler colonialism, which and what was done to Aboriginal people is what settlers always do, and the big push. And we're going through a renewed attack on Indigenous people here in Queensland under the rubric of law and order and keeping Queensland safe. Unbelievable. but it is true. So we're at another dark time.
Yeah, thank you both for your responses. I would like to ask like two more practical questions related to pedagogy, however. Gary mentioned earlier that Chris, you are a practitioner and an intellectual at the same time. There is a kind of a strong counter argument against the engagement with philosophy or meta theory. And this is that you can do all this fantastic applied work that benefits your community, but without engaging with what seems to be a very complex or inaccessible jargon, and some people cannot see why this is useful for us, right? Including critical realism. So I just wanted to ask, how do you respond like to this? To people who raise these objections, like who they wanna make a meaningful impact in their communities, but they question the relevance of emancipatory philosophies.
Yeah, interesting. Let me reflect on the period post Cherbourg. So I was at Cherbourg for 6.5, nearly 7 years, and we had achieved a lot of success. Like attendance at the school had gone from 62% to 94%. Enrollments went from, when I got there, it was about 85. It went to 165 kids. So enrollments almost doubled because people liked what was happening in the school and they become more engaged. The number of local people employed at the school would have increased fourfold, possibly fivefold actually. So there was a really positive experience over that time, and there was deep engagement, all of which is the practice. And part of the feedback that I really liked was, and I continue to like, is that when people come to visit the school, and we had a lot of visitors at the school, when they'd come into the staff room, and Gary was reflecting on this point the other day, they'd come into the staff room and there were Aboriginal folks who were local sitting at front and center of the staff room in a serious dialogue about the children and what direction we were going on, all of that kind of thing. And the non-Indigenous teachers who were at the school, they were just a part of the conversation, but they weren't the central part of the conversation. And people walked in and they thought, yeah, this is a Black school. This is an Aboriginal school. This community owns this school and they're in charge of its direction. And it was true, So we achieved a lot of success. And then there were questions about, okay, so what is the next step for me personally and professionally? Do I go to another school and I prove it in a different kind of school, or do I go to another? Do I go and work in central office? I'd finished my PhD I was close to finish so do I go into the world of academia? Some of those options seemed a little nauseating, but I thought I continue to have, because of those personal experiences of knowing what it's like to be sold short, I was kind of a mind to want to have a greater impact in the shortest amount of time. And so that's why we set up the Stronger Smarter Institute. And so it caused us to have to reflect on what were the key elements of the success that we delivered at Cherbourg School. And so we came up with what we called the Stronger Smarter philosophy. And again, walking with Roy helped me to see it and understand it in this kind of way, because I knew there were two things that I was mindful of, and that people were already being threatened by the success that we were having, because it meant that they were going to have to lift their performance. There was no place to hide anymore. So I knew that as we say, as a black fella, I knew that there would be people trying to come up with all sorts of excuses, and I knew that as an education professional, there'd be other principals who would want to come up with all kinds of excuses. So the educators would say, oh yeah, but you can make that change and you can have that transformation because it's an Aboriginal community school and you're Aboriginal, or because you're a man, or because it's only a primary school, or it's monocultural environment, so don't expect too much of me. So I was mindful of those excuses and ready to take them on. The second part was for us as blackfellas, and that is I was mindful that there would be other Aboriginal folks right across Australia who would say, yeah, look, you might have achieved that success at Cherbourg, but this is my community, this is not Cherbourg. So don't come here telling us how to do things and how to lecture us. So again, as I said, having had the very great privilege of walking with Roy at various times along that journey, I knew that we had to get above that and articulate this stronger, smarter approach as a philosophy. And we came up with very key sort of what we call the meta strategies, or the particular elements of the stronger, smarter philosophy. And it was, the features of it are this, so that if we were to work with, that we could get success in schools where there was a sense of nurturing, a sense of positive cultural identity, embracing positive community leadership, and the notion of high expectations relationships. So we articulated that in a philosophical sense, and that enabled us to go all around the country and to say to Aboriginal folks and education folks, here are the overarching philosophical elements to what we're talking about. Now, if you understand those philosophical elements and you seek to apply them locally, then we can pretty much guarantee that you will be successful. And so, to come back to your point about the that kind of the need for that convergence between the philosophical and the practical, I like to think that that's a good example of where we said, look, here's something understand it at a philosophical level, and then seek to apply it locally according to your context, and we can deliver success. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I didn't know that. From what you're saying, I understand that critical realism was an integral part of the philosophy of your institute, at least one of the key elements. And that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, because it and you'll recognize the parts that are implicit, but it kind of underpinned a commitment to embracing the humanity of the people that we served. But it also provided license to contemplate the complexity and that sort of ontological depth and understand. We talk about the baggage that people carry, and we work with teachers to say, all right, well, if you imagine their sense of cultural identity, or when they turn up to school, it's not only a tangible school bag that they're carrying. All around them, they're carrying this complexity, the complexity of the morning that they've had, the complexity of intergenerational kind of conditioning and stifling of expectations, having to contend with racism, all of these complexities is something that a child brings to school, but also a teacher brings that to school as well. So it's recognizing that there is complexity and depth to that complexity that is worth kind of stepping back and making time to understand, so that we can apply ourselves and be better in the relationships that we cultivate.
Gary, any comments?
A lot. This big question: is philosophy worth it? And critical realism has difficult moments, but Roy addresses that in Plato, etc. He said that, what we're doing is affected by a philosophy. It's actually mostly bad philosophy. So philosophy is efficacious, and so we should take it seriously. And he used the word seriously a lot. Like, I remember one of the things for me was this. And when I came to Australia in 1975, the Labour government was sacked, and Friedman was involved. It was a major conspiracy involving the American embassy and key people on the right wing, and it was a kind of bloodless coup, but it was a coup, and then we began a period of neoliberalism. Now, we didn't know what was happening. We didn't have the words. We actually called it economic rationalism. It was deeply irrational. we didn't get the idea of what they were doing to us. And the Indigenous world, like Patrick Wolf 2010 piece on settler colonialism, like and distinguishing between franchise colonialism in India and settler colonialism in Australia, those are really important differences. And people, don't like using the word settler about the butchers that were here. But the understanding, what do settler colonists do? They dehumanize. They actually try to undermine self-respect and self-love. That's how they destroy communities, and that's part of the settler colonist impulse. And and of course here we had, like, this was known as terra nullius, the land of no people. The settler colonist discovers, doesn't conquer, and we've had debates and fights about that. And those are all real points of struggle. To decolonize Australia is a very difficult thing to do, and it's an ongoing struggle. And at the moment, it's taking quite a vicious turn. The incoming state government abolished the Truth Commission, didn't want to know about the truth of the massacres in Queensland, one of the worst places actually, didn't want to know that. And they call that the black armband view of history, and we must go forward, it's very interesting. But it's, I say, philosophy and concepts and categories help us. And one of the things I personally, what made it sort of easier for me, because I was reared a Northern Irish Catholic in a surviving British colony and part of Ireland, and I knew about prejudice and being, and I knew about going to a university in Belfast, Queen's University, in 1964. It was a Protestant university, and we Catholics sat there and we didn't belong in in what was our native country. And so I understand settler colonialism. I understand the concept of massacres, and so that helped me relate to Chris and Chris's people, and also express a solidarity with them. And Basker's writing on solidarity is very good, esoteric solidarity. If I were in your position, this is what I would do. And I know I'm not in your position, but if I were, and this, I truly, seriously mean this, and that's been my approach to Indigenous affairs, really. If I were in your position, I would do this. And it's like, you give advice, and Chris, in his wisdom, has ignored key bits of my advice, and he's turned out to be inevitably right. I told him not to go to Cherbourg. Above all, do not go. I said, oh, Jesus, don't even think of it. And that was like, it was genuinely bad advice. Which,
I had forgotten that, actually.
He phoned me up and thought, oh, no, don't even think of it.
I think you wanted me to be an academic.
Yes, well, you had an academic career. But
yeah, it would have been an interesting sliding doors moment, and I don't know that I would have landed in a place of being able to influence to the same extent, because if I'd gone
no, there
was academic kind of,
there was a niche carved out for you of minimal relevance, maximum publicity. For in terms of what your people needed. They needed the strong and smart philosophy. They needed that,
and look, maybe there's something in that, Gary, about if I'd have gone, I could have still articulated and maybe this comes back to your point, and Andreas, is had I gone and wandered up and down the halls of academia, I could have still espoused the stronger, smarter approach from there. But unless I had applied it, it would not have been listened to the same extent. Like, I can say to you, attendance went from 62 to 94%, enrollment's almost doubled, those kinds of things. That kind of practical application to the philosophical approach gives it more substance.
Yes, absolutely. Like, it's called walking the talk. And with Indigenous people, like they're very, well, basically extraordinarily polite. They will listen to you and think you don't know what you're talking about, but they're very polite. You know,
Thank you for your advice, Gary.
you know, they enjoy Irish people, Indigenous people, go saying, but but walk the talk, and that was it. But I mean, as I say, a solidarity, of course, but you don't direct. The strategy is in the hands of Indigenous people. Roy says we don't emancipate people, it's self-emancipation. It's we don't give, we don't come down, and that's the real temptation for an outsider, like a white man. And you're not there to liberate. You're there to express solidarity. You know.
Yeah, thank you both. I'm teaching now at the University of Thessaly in Greece, and it's a department of preschool education, and I'm teaching philosophy of science. So,
Wow.
Most of my students, like the way they're trained, they have little patience for philosophical conceptualization because most of them, they see themselves as practitioners, right? So in the beginning, it's really difficult to explain that, these are really important issues, and these are not just for elite philosophers, but questions of philosophy concern all of us, in our daily lives, right? So I wanted to ask you this question because my students,
sorry, you go, Andres. Yeah.
No, they cannot see the relevance, and I think that this really depends on how we teach philosophy of science. And this is the last point that I wanted to make and ask you, like, because you have engaged in emancipatory pedagogy, both of you, and education, right? I wonder if you have any pedagogical insights on how you can make these ideas, even if it's not, even if you don't talk explicitly about critical realism, but how can we make these ideas relevant to pupils or students?
I think the point is this, Andreas, and Gary will back me up on this, is that the young people that you're lecturing to and who will become teachers, and they will see themselves as practitioners and have no need for philosophy. But it's like this. When a fish swims in water, it doesn't know that there's water all around it. And so they're teaching in those classrooms, and they might perceive themselves as just practitioners, but they are driven by a philosophical approach that exists that they've not made the time to explicitly understand. And so when you think about the time at Sherbrooke School, the water, so to speak, was kind of tarnished and stale and filthy and toxic almost, and it existed, but we didn't really take the time to stop and say, hey, what's doing with this water all around us? And that water was loaded with a contamination of that colonizing sort of mindset, that sort of ethnocentric mindset that was kind of like, this is the way. So it exists, and it influences how we think and how we believe and how we behave. And the same is true for the students that you're lecturing to. And so it's really important for them to stop and look and say, hey, what's doing with that water, this water that we're surrounded in? So I think if that metaphor is useful, then you should steal it and make use of it. Because that's the truth, that every teacher in a classroom here and in Greece, they will be, their behaviors, their beliefs, and that will be anchored by a philosophy that might be so predominant that they don't even know that it exists. And so that's why it's really important to interrupt that and get them to stop and look around and think about what's around them and what are alternative philosophical approaches. And I think that's what we did at Sherbrooke. We flushed out the water and we introduced an alternative philosophical approach, which is about strong and smart, high expectations relationship. Let's embrace education in a way that we can not surrender our sense of cultural identity, but actually strengthen it. That's a completely different paradigm to what existed previously. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I actually really like the idea of using metaphors to make this relevant. Gary, do you have any comments on that?
Well, that's the key. Like the advantages of being old, as one Aboriginal kid said to me, you very old. One advantage of being old, I actually have lived through 2.5 paradigms. I've lived through the beginning of the Keynesian paradigm, and the beginning of the neoliberal paradigm, and the intellectual confusion, not understanding the paradigmatic shift. The water was changing, and now since the crash of neoliberalism 2008, we are in this kind of what Reinhardt called, the German philosopher called, saddle time. There is no dominant paradigm at the moment, and that is why governments are coming and going. So this is a saddle site, like a saddle time. We have not, and it's like a marketplace. We're competing for a part of the stronger, smarter paradigm, to take place on education. It's very, very different. It's different from the paternalism of Keynesianism. It's community based, and it's about self-governance and self-emancipation, but it's the embryo of an alternative paradigm. And one day these words will be taken for granted, and people won't know where they came from. But Chris's whole life is a struggle, actually, to change the water and to get people to to accept what are strange and radical ideas. It's a big thing. It's a big thing, but it will happen, actually. But this saddle time, if we don't vanish in a world war, this will be a time of great ferment.
And that's why I think it's useful to come back to Roy's philosophy. The critical realist philosophy allows us to understand the importance of being able to connect at the level of our humanity, and bring all of our differences and mediations to the relationships that lay before us, and be met by people who are not going to be spooked by our differences, and not think that we have to iron those differences out so that you have to be like me. Effectively, you have to be colonized to be like me. A new, like Roy's philosophical approach, would let us come to each other with all of who we are and all of our mediations, in a way that sees us connect at the level of our humanity, and to celebrate and be curious about the differences that we bring, and see those as opportunities for all of us to thrive. I think it's really useful to think of it and to come back to his philosophy like that.
I wanted to, if I may say, one of the things I learned talking to the Indigenous people at the conference, I was brought up Irish Catholic, and we argue and fight and quite savage intellectual and non-intellectual struggles, but it's really different in the Indigenous world. Looking at it now as an outsider, Indigenous intellectuals, their first move is not to cut the throat of the other person like it is with the Irish. We're great stabbers, back, front, knees, anywhere, but the first move of the Indigenous is to seek the humanity of the other person, even if they have profound disagreements with them. It's the protocol it's to seek the humanity. It frustrates me because I want intellectual battles. I want I want the Appian Way with crucifixions of all the enemy. But but it's interesting. It's the Indigenous way. It is a very, very different way of being in the world. It's very ancient, and then I think it's very wise. I concede the wisdom to it, but that struck me talking to the old people at the Chris's conference, and they've got this thing called yarning circles where they talk away to meaning. And it's the social meaning that emerges from it, not the individualist meaning. It's the individual. It's all the levels from the unique individual right through to the common core humanity, and it's very interesting.
And it's more than that, Gary. It's not just about how we come to each other as human beings. It's how we come to the universe that we live in, how we come to the environment that we live in.
For sure.
The footsteps that we leave on the world, and how we relate to all that is around us, the whole ecosystem that we share.
And the meaning of the being on country, that's a very profound experience, on country, it's very, and there's stuff to be learned, but it's key part of the settler colonist thing is that They were an uncivilized, wretched people, and we brought them civilization. And it's absolutely key. If you challenge that, then the whole thing falls apart, or changes.
Thank you both for your interventions. Really, I mean, I had so many questions for this first part, but I don't want to hold you more than what we said.